Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. This is David Bianco. Today's audio excursion is going to be a vinyl shootout, the recent Rhino release on their High-Fidelity Series of the Black Sabbath self-titled album, remastered by none other than Kevin Gray. Now, this is an album that a lot of people have been waiting for, anything of Black Sabbath, and this one sold out in less than a week, all 5,000 copies. And now it's fetching in the used market $125 to $150 compared to its original price of $40. So let's see if it makes the grade on our Safe and Sound Texas audio excursion. A special shout out to one of our vinyl community veterans, Vinyl Piper Chris, for helping me out on this shootout. He graciously offered to send me his versions of this album to compare to the Rhino. Now, Black Sabbath for me really didn't come into vogue until Paranoid came out, and I definitely liked that album. And when it came out on 4-channel CD4 LP, I was really into it. It is one of the better, distinct, discrete, separated records of rock and roll that was done during the heyday of the 2 to 3 years that 4-channel survived in the format wars that occurred. But that being the case, other Black Sabbath music was made aware to me at the time, and I went back to their catalog, to their earlier stuff, including the self-titled album, and liked it quite a bit, but didn't actually ever pick up a copy. And so that's why I had asked Vinyl Piper Chris to allow me to do this with the versions that he had, which were in fact a white label promo from Warner Brothers, and again a greenie from Warner Brothers. Those are both first pressing artisans, so they are the cream of the crop, the creme de la creme. We also have a third pressing of a UK version, which from what I have understood, the first 3 pressings of that are pretty much the same. And we also have a German first pressing as well. And they were all pressed basically through the same process from what I see on Discogs, lacquer cut at Phonodisc BV, and then the German was pressed by Dutch Gramophone pressing plant. So those are very similar. And so I'll start off by saying what I ended up doing here is comparing the US's to the US's and the German to the UK, and found that they were so similar to their counterparts across the ocean or within the ocean here that the greenie and the white label, I just used the white label for my comparisons, and then the German and the UK, I just used the UK for representation of the across the pond versions. So those two I then compared to the Rhino High Fidelity. And so in doing so and going through the songs that are on the album, especially Wasp, The Wizard, Black Sabbath title tune, got to know those songs a bit, got to listen for distinctions in the drumming, in the guitar work, the voices, some of the percussion like tambourines, harmonica, various sounds that were more distinct and that I could really get a beat on in making comparisons. Now, I have the ability to A/B switch these two. My method is often, I think, like Jason Rojas's, which he uses a mixer, which is a similar type method. Now, up front, I want to say, until now, today, after I've done my conclusions and got ready to record, I hadn't really listened or seen any of those. I happened to see Jason's to see what method he used. I'm not going to be playing any of the comparisons back to back on here for a variety of reasons. One is that he's already done it, it appears. But my conclusions are still based now on not seeing the conclusions of any video at this point. So it'll be interesting for me to go back after I do this now and see what others had to say as well. Again, as always, shootouts and reviews are based on my equipment and based on my ears and my room, and so mileage may vary, but I stand by the distinctions that I did hear within my setup, and so I stand by those. So overall, giving you a basic overview, what I would say is this. There are some characteristics that are very unique in some ways between these and very common in others. What I was most surprised by, I guess in a macro sense, is that from my perspective, I thought the US's did better, the OGs, the US's did better than the UK's. I thought they were more powerful, they had deeper bass, the voices were on par, and the highs were they were a tad light compared to the UK, but the UK was almost a little bit too much in some sections. So my first overall impression is that I liked the US OG, and in this case, the white label, which is what I used because it and the greenie seemed so similar when I compared them. There's much more impact in the drums I felt with the US. The UK just seemed a little bit thinner to me overall. And it's not that I expected that, frankly, but that's what I heard. And so the U.S. had a little thicker, richer, impactful kind of impression to it that was in some areas a little weaker on the UK. Now, there were a few areas where the UK, like some of the harmonica sections, that were a little breathier. You could get a little more, feel a little more breath out of that than you could with the US. But those distinctions were not near as frequent as the things that stood out more as it related to the US version. So overall, the U.S. really was a positive surprise to me, and in the way the U.K. was a little bit, because I've always heard the vertigo swirl, they're always the best. And my thing about all these things is this. There are norms in the sense that most often one certain one will generally sound better characteristically, but that doesn't always occur in every particular record that comes out. So I would call those generalizations. And I don't want to make those generalizations no more than I would want to make them to say that reissues are always better either. It is always on a case-by-case basis. And so that's why we do these. There are times that I'm surprised with what the outcomes are, and there are times when maybe I think, well, that's kind of what I maybe thought was going to happen. But in this case, the US's were very strong, I felt. And frankly, if I was going to say I would have a bias up front where I might have pre-considered what I expected to happen, I would tell you that I would have expected the UK to beat the US. And in this case, for my ears and my system, I don't think it does on balance. I really think the US's were very impactful. And so that's how I feel about what I heard related to that distinction. Now then, in doing that, realizing that I felt the U.S. was better, I then, of course, made the comparison to the Kevin Gray and the High-Fidelity Rhino. And my impressions of that, of course, are, it's a newer pressing, it's quieter vinyl, so you obviously have that advantage. And the Rhino was what I would call very accurate, very balanced. And so it was, there were things about it that didn't over distinguish it or undersell it either. And so it was enjoyable to listen to from the perspective of it was a newer record. It had that fresh sound to it. It was very accurate. But at the same time, the U.S. just had a little more mojo, I guess, for me in that regard. It just had a little bit more. But I heard things in the Rhino that I attuned to and that I then had to go back to and listen on the US. And I said, oh yeah, it's there, but it wasn't quite as accurate for me because there was so much going on and it was more intense on the US version than, and so the Rhino kind of pulled it apart a little bit more. So in some ways, the Rhino really provided a little different, I would say, view if I was looking, but hearing things that were a little bit more distinct and more augmented beyond what I had heard in the other pressings, to where I then, when I went back to that and I A-B'd it, I said, yeah, it's there. It just that maybe there was some other sounds in that particular section that maybe were overbearing of it a bit, to where I didn't pick it up as much. So I would say that it is more accurate and balanced in the Rhino in that regard. So, it's not really a statement of good versus bad. It's a little different. And I think that possibly, trying to get this really accurate and like what the tape sounded like, as opposed to maybe trying to promote a little bit of the sound at a certain range when it first came out to make it impressionable, I would say, may have been the intention, and maybe why the U.S. was a little hotter in a few ways. But it certainly was, it had that impact. But I certainly appreciated what I heard on the Rhino. And I would tell you to pick up a copy for $40 when you could. That's a good deal, because I think it really gives you a nice clean copy that sounds really, really strong. And so it's one of those situations. And I hadn't really gone back and looked at the valuation on Discogs to pick up a used original US and or a UK. I tend to think they're all a little pricey now, even the Rhino in the three figures, right, to get them. So it's really going to be one where you're going to have to take together what you've seen and heard in maybe other reviews. And again, I don't know what those outcomes were. I may be 180 degrees off of them. I don't know. But I do stand by the fact that the Rhino is very solid. It's very good. I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I think that there were some distinctions in it between quieter vinyl, and there are sections in the record that is helpful, and the fact that there are some distinctions in accuracy that were drawn out a bit, that were a bit more congested in the US because it was much more powerful. Now, just to sit down and get that raw energy of Black Sabbath, that US one does you well. It does you well, really well, and it's very intense, and I'm very proud to say the US pressed something that sounded that good, because I was in fact expecting the UK was going to be the one that pushed me back in the chair a bit more, and it didn't as much as the US did on my system with my ears. They're all good. There's nothing bad, and there's always some room where one has a distinction versus the other. I will say that some of the accuracy on the Rhino, on the cymbal work, could be to some a bit much. Now, I don't mean anything that would get near where we would say there was anything problematic in the symbolism that's going on, semblance that's going on at all. It's not that kind of sound at all. But sometimes the intensity of the hits on the cymbals and some of that high-end work on there, the accuracy may be a tad too accurate. And some of the sound in the US that was a little more mid-rangey and bassy, that kind of, I won't say covered for that, but distracted your hearing a bit and didn't make that sound as sharp, I think could in fact be less problematic to some people in their hearing. I could see that would be the case. And again, we're getting back to, certain sounds have certain sweet spots to certain people and maybe some annoyances in other ways as well. So you got to put all that together. But clearly, I've got to say, Rhino and Kevin Gray did a great job on this record, putting it out. Of course, the whole discussion about 5,000 limit on this one, it's like, yeah, they could have blown the doors off and done a lot more than that, but that's what they're doing right now. Maybe it'll get reissued at one point, but it's certainly a solid, clean copy with a lot of accuracy, and I feel that a really strong job was done there, as was done with the U.S. original as well. And so it's kind of like make your choices. I think that I would, in fact, settle with the Rhino because it's a good balance to me. I enjoyed it, and I found it very engaging. And I also found that, since I bought one for $40, I don't have to be searching out these other copies as well. So that's kind of what I came up with. Let's look at what the numbers look like. So the rating system sometimes can be difficult to articulate and to understand from the receiver's standpoint, because I will get comments like, oh, gee, if it's only half a point difference between these two, is that enough to justify it? Well, look at it this way. It's not a matter. A lot of these records start in the 7s and 8s in the scale of 10. So they're already way up there in that regard. So now it's relative difference and impact. So I think one has to just put that on and put the perspective on of what in fact is being looked for and what is most important to you in sound, and maybe what representations I've given that aligned to what your likes, dislikes are, or vice versa, don't align to those as well. So starting with the UK and the German releases, which are very similar sounding, the Vinyl Quietness is an 8. Obviously, it's a little older record, quite a few years old, and so an 8 rating is about pretty normal in the range for this, but it does in fact affect the number, of course, because it tends to be one of the lower ratings a used record will get. The bass on here was 8 1/4, as are the mids, so they definitely have presence and some accuracy, but you'll see that they're not quite up to what we experienced with the other ones. And then treble is 8.5. Now the treble here has degrees of accuracy that are a little better than the other two and some that are not. So there's a little bit of variability across the board in treble on these records, but on the whole, they each had a fairly decent sounding treble, so I gave them all the same rating, but they didn't all sound exactly the same. It's hard to put that to it. As I mentioned earlier, the Rhino could sound in a way to some people a little distracting on that end if their sensitivity is to that. Because of the accuracy of it. So that one's a little harder to quantify, I would say, because of some of the variability that was done in the recording and I think in the way it was mastered and the outcomes. Imaging is not exactly the strongest suit of this version of the record, actually. It's not quite as profound or pronounced as to what the imaging is and the placement of things. Now, this record isn't exactly a gem for that in general, but on its own, it didn't seem as problematical in this area, but once you started to compare it, you started to recognize that. And Soundstage, similarly, we had some areas there that really, to me, didn't stand up quite as well once I started to compare them. So it ended up with a 49 total on the UK and German. Moving to the US artisan pressings, whether, of course, it was the green or the promo. We used the promo for the raw comparisons when I found the green and the white label were pretty much the same. 8 on quietness as well, but 8.75 on the bass. Definitely more beefiness to it. And the mids were a little better, a little more well-defined in the voices in certain areas where you really needed it. Treble again, 8.5 again, and its degree of accuracy being very similar, but again, they sounded just a tad different in certain sections of certain songs in those areas. And the soundstage was definitely more well-defined, as was the imaging here, 8.5 there, because there was some better distinctions and openness to the sound in this recording, which yielded it a 50.75 total score. And out of 60. And then when we have the Rhino Hi-Fi, we get a quieter piece of vinyl. Of course, it's newer, a 9 there. Bass was 8.5, but just not quite as well-defined as the U.S. Version was. But in the mids, the voices and some of the articulation and precision there was a hair better than the U.S. Treble again was about the same across the board, just variations of how it sounded a little differently. Again, some people with some sensitivities maybe on that, or even maybe a setup issue could have a little bit of a different opinion about that on the treble side. But overall, by and large, they were very, very similar, with some sounding a little different in different areas. And then imaging and the soundstage a little better than the US, a little better precision, a little better definition, yielding it the 52.25 scores. So you see basically there we have 6 different categories, 10 max each would be 60. So that's where the rankings came out for this particular shootout. As a final mathematical gymnastic for those of you that have stuck around, if you take out the quiet vinyl factor here, because you do have an advantage with the newer pressing, you then have a scale of 50. And you see that the difference between the Rhino and the USOG is only half a point here at that point, because that factor influenced it a little bit more. So just musically, when you take this and compare them, now you're even closer yet. Again, it's a difference in the sound of precision and maybe a little more accuracy with the Rhino, whereas you have a little more gutsiness and rawness a bit to the original, but not quite as much precision. Again, those are stylistic and really a decision one has to make individually, how they would want that to sound to them. I want to be really clear though, this is not nearly as clinical of a difference as we saw with Michael Jackson Thriller, where the MoFi one step was very clinical and not nearly, let's say, as danceable as the original was. I mean, that one really made a big emotional difference and a response difference. This kind of music with Black Sabbath isn't that kind of music, obviously, but it does in fact evoke a bit of the sound and the rawness of the way the music is stylistically in the voices, where the OG has a little more guttural kind of feel to it, I would say, versus the Rhino, which is a little more pleasurable, a little more sonic on that sound, and maybe loses just a little bit of that edge. And so again, it's a matter of what you would prefer and how you would care to listen to it and what you're expecting it to feel like and be like. So there you go. This one was a little bit more difficult in some ways, but again, results were a little different than I expected, and that's why we do these things. So as always, thanks for watching, and if you haven't, to subscribe, please click on the bell below for notifications. We do these all the time. Would love to have you join, and a like or thumbs up is appreciated for the algorithm, as are those comments. Keep them coming. So until we catch you next time, thanks for joining me today on our Safe and Sound Texas audio excursion. Take care, everybody. Happy 4th of July.